Welcome everyone. So we're gathered here for the final session of the ABC School, the Think-In, which is meant to be a bit of a conclusive session and to sort of get us moving into what will come, the various possibilities that will come out of the conversation that we've sustained for 6 weeks. So I'll begin with land acknowledgement, as we always have. So we're gathered here from many locations, and we will begin by acknowledging the ground beneath our feet, and that it's historically been the home of indigenous people, many of whom have been forced out of marginalized in their own territories. We must also recognize that while we are the beneficiaries of this virtual space, what connects us at this moment are computer screens, software, servers, etc., all built on extractive and exploitative practices, specifically involving labor and prevalent around the world. So in this Think-In, we'll be following the community agreements that we've previously used. I'll be reading them. I think you're probably all very familiar with them by now. So assume that everyone is acting in good faith and with positive intent. Create an inclusive and respectful space for everyone. Acknowledge and respect people's pronouns, cultural differences, and backgrounds. Self-care is of utmost importance. Please feel free to take breaks. One person speaks at a time. Respect the spirit of the progressive stack. Turn on your video if possible. If you need to step away, please turn off your video. Mute your microphone when not speaking. Keep chat to everyone to a minimum, aside from questions for the presenters or facilitators, or when saying stack. And most importantly, have fun. So to prepare for today, you probably took a look at a form that you are likely to have submitted an answer to. We've anonymized these answers, and for the sake of facilitating the conversation going forward, I'm sharing a link in the stack to these responses. And I'll be passing on to Peggy, who will be giving you some overarching comments about those responses. Peggy, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you.
You're muted, I think.
I'm muted? I'm okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so before I give just general responses to the provocations and what you wrote, just to reiterate some of our thinking about this ABC summer school, and partly because the thinking that came to this and that formed this school in the way it's been presented to you and that you've participated in, those thoughts are very much in some ways still around and very much alive in the provocations that you have. But so let me just kind of go through that. Initially, there was in the architecture lobby that has a number of different campaigns. This one, which was called the Academia Caucus, got together and thought about 3 different scales at which we could rethink academia. One was kind of immediate, kind of guerrilla action on courses that are there, institutions that are there, hacking things, inserting syllabi that weren't authenticated, going to each other's reviews, various things. That was one scale. Another scale was the summer school, something that was doable but slightly more ambitious. And then the other one was a real, a real school. And just, I think I've said this before, but those all kind of collapsed around the most practical, in as much as we had time to think about it, and it was a doable scale, became the ABC Architecture Beyond Capitalism Summer School. But there were a lot of questions that we went through. One is, what do we call ourselves? In as much as we didn't want a student teacher thing, was it right to call ourselves participants? What constituted knowledge and who had the right to deliver knowledge? Experts people on the ground, people who are not yet institutionalized. How do we get participants to commit? Should we have you pay? Should we have you pay initially and you get your money back after you're done? You know, should this be free? This was, and you know, which we did. And yeah, so then also what kind of constitutes a commitment, which then had to do with thinking through what it meant for some of you to be willing to do assignments and do kind of creative work, while others were going to be auditors who wanted to pay attention but weren't going to have the time or the inclination to do those assignments. So what constitutes those different kinds of commitments? You know, and also the question of how much the lobby and us organizers of this school, you know, we're all lobby members, would lead this or just present the opportunities for discussion. And just to say, these are questions that we came down on in certain ways, but I think are still alive in many of the things that the provocations that came up. And, you know, but just to let you know that none of this was God-given, it was hotly debated. So in the context of that, I think our general sense as a kind of summary of reaction to the provocations that you put in there, one is how fundamental the idea of the school as an institution is. You know, what that we kind of offered this one opportunity, but the identity of this, certificates, degrees, how much it imitates the profession, how much it has to change the profession, in what institutional, organizational logics and systems does this operate in? And so we're kind of very heartened to see how those fundamental questions are still coming up in your provocations. Another is, you know, how the scale of things that still need to be debated on something that I think we agree on still needs to have a life after this. And one is the fundamental, you know, really ideological questions about the idea of change, the scale of change, what does change mean, that those still need to be very much debated and they're not resolved in this school. Another one was seeing how many organizations are in place that we need to connect with and learn from. That's very inspiring. Many of you are part of organizations already that need to be galvanized in some way. Also, you know, just I want to say how many of you are thinking through seriously the questions that we were seriously debating at the beginning, which is to say, the ongoing need for a forum like this, whatever form that forum takes. But there is too much that has been opened up here for a cap to be put on it or a bow of action plans to be identified from it. So yeah, in general, it was kind of inspiring to feel that your questions and provocations mirror those that we still are very anxious about and want to solve. So anyway, but before we maybe go on to thinking about how we parse the discussion, first with, you know, with questions about the academy, which Priyanka is going to moderate for us or you know, orchestrate for us. Are there any additional thoughts from the other organizers, you know, about just general overview observations? Okay, so again, we're kind of, you know, going to try and divide the discussion around different themes. The question of the kind of academy, the nature of the institution of the academy, you know, is the first one. But then other questions that can come up about the local or the present and how particular we need to lodge either the content of this or the procedural form of this will be second. And then we'll come back to next steps and hopefully in all of this. So if that makes sense to everybody, Priyanka, do you want to begin to?
Yes, I can jump right in. So what I'm going to do is just kind of, thematically summarize some of the responses that we got for the Academy section back from all of you, and then we'll open it up to Stack. I think everyone knows by now what Stack is. Just add your name to the chat, and we'll run a Stack, and your turn will progressively come up, and you can pose your questions. And the whole point of the thinking is for all of us to think together. We're not going to do breakout rooms today. We're not going to break up into smaller groups. We're all going to talk together. And so to jump into the Academy section, the first question we posed was broadly about change. And so just to kind of frame the question, you know, it, it's around the idea of theories of change, which we are not necessarily debating in detail today, but the idea of incrementalism versus fundamental change. And these are both, sort of two different theories of change, and it helps us categorize tactics in one or the other. But the other thing that we are doing through this effort of the school is also acknowledging the pragmatic reality in which this change has to kind of be affected. And so the notion of a pragmatic reality is not something to put a limit on imagination, but simply to take stock of the enemy fully before we can, figure out what our tactics or our sort of motions of change are. So that was one big framing, and there were answers on both sides, things about fundamentally upending the system versus, very sharp sort of focus levers that can be turned within the academy as it is. One of the answers that offered almost a third way of looking at this was not so much about changing the academy, but using the academy and leveraging the academy to affect other forms of change in society that we are, after. So for instance, the academy is centers capital, for instance. We can use that to do projects and to provoke, the kind of dissatisfactions that both students and faculty have towards a greater solidarity, towards programs and ideas that can be used to affect change. And so really the academy then becomes a tool, which is different from the academy itself changing. The other question was about degrees and accreditations, and they kind of stretch from the academy to the profession. And so there were questions of, can there be a new type of credential? And what this captures for us is that accreditation has conventionally been thought of as a way of validating professional, as a device of maintaining professional standards, that you have to have that barrier to entry because then that someone meets a certain standard of qualifications to provide a certain standard of service. But we also know that these are barriers to entry and they contribute to making the professional society. And in that sense, they contribute to replicating privilege. And so we're looking at accreditation and degrees from that lens as well. And again, in the pragmatic reality, this gets complicated for us because in the present day system, accreditation is also a way for class mobility, for underrepresented groups who have not been part of the profession traditionally to get accredited and to be valid parts of the profession. So how do you, and there will always be a group of people who seek that validation, and rightly so. And so how do you rethink accreditation, both from a standpoint of social capital and a standpoint of, in some ways, professional rigor? And some other questions that came up were, could our school be an accredited course at a seminar or an existing university, which is something for us to talk about together. And this idea of a third university, which was one of our readings, right? And so those are other things that we have to take on. And from the kind of pedagogical side, there were several comments about the insularity of architectural education, that it is so divorced both from the pragmatism of how architecture is deployed in the world, the way it is conceived and built, but also from social reality, which is the kind of political milieu in which this architecture is deployed, that we are kind of woefully disconnected in our studios and schools from both these, imperatives. And finally, perhaps the biggest thing, especially in the United States, that student debt is perhaps one of the biggest barriers, both to entry, perpetuation, and the kind of opportunities that one can take advantage of. And literally the fault lines of student debt are perfectly overlay the fault lines of, everything that's happening in the profession. And finally, there was also the role possibly played by an informal education. So actually performing acts of architecting, and are those ways of inducting people into the profession that are kind of parallel to a pure academic pedagogical model. So that was for the academy. The last question was about design. And there were some questions were like, duh, how can you even say that whether design should be part of an architectural education? But there were many responses that said we need to demystify design. We need to kind of knock design off this pedestal of privilege that it occupies and begin to complicate what design means. And the design, another provocative response was the design is a way of reimagining the world. And it stimulates a different mental muscle. It's more synthetic than the analytical modalities of history or theory. And architecture is perhaps one of the only disciplines and types of education that offers an education in synthesis and in offering a different model of the world. So that creative element really needs to remain in the pedagogical model of architecture. So I'll end my summary there, and we'll open it up to stack. You've all given your responses. We haven't read them out in detail, so please feel free to kick this off. And repeat what you might have written or what you think you have a burning desire to talk with others about. And Valerie is going to maintain stack, sorry.
Kirsten, you're on stack.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so in the States, is it, so in Australia, as part of our registration as architects, there is an expectation that we have ongoing education. And so it's not just, I've just got my degree and that's it, I can do whatever I want for the rest of my life. Is there as part of registration, is there this ongoing expectation that you do so much self-education through the years?
I can take a quick, it depends on the state, and it also depends on, so you don't graduate with a license. So once you're licensed, there is some onus to keep getting accreditation points to kind of, if the system is designed to keep people abreast of the sort of latest developments in the field. And there are various ways the AIA offers accreditation points for participating in various kinds of education, or, learning from vendors and learning from courses and stuff like that. And that it is on you to make sure that your points are collected. And the way to do it is through those
things. Okay. Because it's interesting. We've got a similar thing in Australia, although we have far fewer people, where we do have, each state has its own set of rules and regulations. But when it comes to sort of an understanding broadly at sort of more federal level, because of all these loopholes, it's very difficult to try and unpick and understand, or to try and think about ways that we change when each state has its own sort of permutation. And while we've only got 7 and you've got over 50, it becomes this interesting, how do we start to navigate that when we start to think about how can we start to implement change? Just more of a question and as an open idea than anything else.
Susan, did you want to say anything else about that? You're muted.
I think she was saying, no, that's all good.
I don't really have more to add to that.
So yeah, this stack is open, and we can just go sort of topic by topic, and maybe kick it off with this idea of change, and what kind of change do you think that our provocation this summer has offered in terms of what universities could adapt in their current models?
Peggy, you're on stack.
I think
Megan
Megan got there before me.
Yeah.
No, Peggy, you go first, then I'll follow up. How about that?
Okay. I feel a little bad because I've spoken, but I think that question about how specifically targeted subversive action can be given knowing the regulations and how to go beyond those regulations being different in every case is a real interesting question. And I can't divorce it from the question of degrees and accreditation in general, not just in state. And it certainly brings up the question that there is this third way, that there is something that is outside the existing system that builds up to be its own powerful force that bypasses those things. I'm not saying that is my position or the position of but it's certainly when you bring those complications up, you just think, you know what, go your own way and think beyond those.
Megan.
How could we kind of reimagine the architecture school for our, mostly looking at our population, which is first generation college students, a lot of Latinx, ex-military, people who are living at home and are from the area and going to stay in the area and have gone kind of the community college route. And we're currently having a big debate, kind of, should it be accredited, should it not be accredited? And the question about accreditation and licensing is also, you can become a licensed architect without having an accredited degree in many states, and of all states. But if you work, I think 8 or 10 years, you can then start taking your exams and then you can become a licensed architect. So the question is, I personally feel that in today's workplace, an accredited degree is important because it moves you through that process faster. And oftentimes in architecture firms, you can't be moved to an associate level until you are licensed. You can't be moved up, and take on more responsibility until you're licensed. So, if that's one more barrier that certain people cannot move up in a firm, for me, I feel like the accreditation is important. That being said, of course, there are alternatives to doing it. So then, if we're interested in helping our students right now come out of school debt-free and able to get that license, if that is what they want to do, what is the best way to help them do that? And is it through doing all the hoops of having an accredited school and maybe paying a bit more, or is it to empower them to, put in those 10 years before, starting your exams? And I'm not sure. We're very split on it. But anyway, just so that's a little bit background on where I'm coming from.
Thanks, Megan. Kirsten, you're next on the stack.
Yeah, I'm going to just go back to Peggy's point, then I'm going to go back to Megan's point, because I think there's some really interesting things there as well, because we are stuck with this Bologna model. I don't know, I think this works in the States as well, where you've got that 3+2. So that 3 is the undergraduate degree. And then we have so we have got 3, so we've got 3 years. They're now introducing a 4-year honours. And then we have this 2-year master's, which is a professional course. And we have to try and pack everything into those, because that sort of ties in with the markets in China, where a lot of our international students come from, and also enables people to start moving around. Originally, architecture was a 5-year degree here. But what is interesting, and probably a question I should put to Frank, is, what is the cost of education? We still have a lot of our education subsidized by the government here. So we probably don't have that 6 figures, just because we would have no architects if we had that. But it's But I think, yeah, going back to Peggy's point, it is trying to alter things, particularly from our end, is when we're trying to sort of pack in more and more to such smaller pieces, the only space is to try and find something outside. And I was really interested, yeah, so there's the London School. There was also the Free School of Architecture that was happening in LA. What happened with that? Yeah, it's just, okay. And the other one that's been interesting, I've just been doing some papers looking at the late 70s where we used to have an apprenticeship system here, and looking at the debates in sort of Architect magazine here about whether it should be, you know, you have to have this level of education before you can get your license, and just the debates on that about you know, what happens when you remove this apprenticeship system. And yeah, so we've just, now you have to have education before you can even start to sort of get on the bus. But it was really fascinating, because it was about that level of experience that people have versus just you know, a more theoretical approach. So yeah, and it's not going to change anytime without sort of some deep provocation. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking because Stack's filling up.
Thanks, Kirsten. Felipe, you're next on Stack.
Yeah. I'm going to move from topics because I'm talking from a context between Colombia and Mexico, in which accreditation is not a pressing issue at all. You just graduate and you pay $200 and then you get a license. So that's not a problem here. But I wanted to move to our initial topic, and was Architecture Beyond Capitalism. And for me, there's a very problematic question here, and why the insistence on carrying or keeping architecture beyond capitalism, or even academy. You know, why should we keep the whole schooling system from kinder to higher education beyond capitalism? For me, I think at the end of this 6 weeks, that's like my biggest question. No, why do we need to carry it, or what is there so important about the whole schooling system and architecture that we need to carry it? Is there anything that we can rescue from there, or not? Maybe as Priyanka mentioned, design and this synthetic possibility around architecture. But maybe going back to that question, I think would help us, like opening up. And maybe I can also read my prompt from the first one. I think it also helps, also in my case, for organizing my ideas. So I spent the last 3 weeks in Oaxaca, south of Mexico. And I've been moving and thinking for the past months through indigenous autonomous movements, especially through Zapatistas and Misaks and Nazas from Colombia. And I was reading John Holloway, who's this Irish sociologist who works in Puebla, very close with the Zapatistas. So that's a bit of context to my prompt on the notion of doing against labor. I'm just going to read that, and maybe it helps. So the revolt of spatial doings against architectural labor, and this comes from Holloway and his notion, or his distinction between doing and labor, in which I think the insistence on architecture as labor and as this mode of work, of spatial work, might help. So the short prompt is that there is no way schools can stop producing complicit industry workers, and instead produce critically engaged designers, scholars, and activists. Maybe some will escape and imagine other modes of practice doing, but overall, professional education has one and one role only: produce workers. The creation of labor is the creation of the laborer. It cannot be otherwise. Labor cannot be performed if there is no laborer to perform it. Architecture has been obsessively producing new forms in the form of buildings and reflecting on their modes of composition and construction. This permanent obsession has evaded the reflection and practice of other forms of learning, other forms of life, other forms of being architects, and other forms or other praxis, hence neglecting the production of subjectivity, which is overall I think the main issue in academy, the production of subjectivity via the schooling system. So situated together within and against, apart from the space and experience, fields and forces of coloniality with specific attention to Abya Yala, where I'm situated, or the territories now called Latino America, the appealing project of the third university as an almost impossible task in a context where almost 80% of teaching staff, I'm here teaching at Tec de Monterrey, which is a huge corporation, it's a monster. So almost 80% of the teaching staff were part-time, and a third university needs a dedication that most teachers cannot provide. I mean, being a part-time teacher, there's no way that you can do a third university by teaching 4 hours a week. It is necessary first to negate, to refuse our complicity with capital, in this case the academy, and refuse labor and professionalization. And we could look beyond radical professionalism, beyond activism, and move to the cracks that prefigurative autonomous practices open and sustain. In this case, I'm thinking through the case of Mexico with Producción Social del Hábitat, that would be social production of habitat, which is very strong in South America, and move from the struggle of labor against capital to the revolts of doing against labor and therefore against capital. There's an urgent need to imagine and pursue autonomous learning spaces outside the university, focus on territorial transformations, because questioning the core of architectural education should radically resignify architecture and open up to unforeseen modes of doing space. I'll leave it there. The rest is.
Thanks, Felipe. Wes, you're next on stack.
Felipe got there. I'm going to applaud Felipe's comment. I basically had a very similar thing, I think, if I'm understanding what Felipe is saying. Architecture is a professional work, right? And students who are choosing to take on the debt that's required for accreditation or participation are choosing to become part of the bourgeoisie in a particular way. It's a class choice. It's not just work choice. It's not just labor choice. We're revisiting some of the things we read about with Marx, right? For proletariat to participate in architecture work is to pass into a professional class. That movement, we could move backwards, right? We could ask the bourgeoisie to proletarize their work, but that's different than I think what I'm hearing Felipe getting at, which is starting with the working class and staying there, not expecting people to move into this professionalized, this wealthy, this capital worship posture of labor. And for that, yeah, I haven't seen that. I've never seen that. Architecture, as I understand it, Architecture Beyond Capital is still going to be a professional set of tasks for professionals with particular accreditations. And that's very different than the process of placemaking or habitat creation that has always been indigenous, has always been available. And the people who already do that work, their inclusion within the architecture discourse may be the question, right? It may not be a question of how do we bring folks who are not professionals into this professional work, but how do we break down what we've built to be able to listen to what is around us and has been in some places exterminated. And I'm thinking especially in my neighborhood in Philadelphia. But my wife's family is in South Dakota. We were just out there. There's really cool conversations happening with the Sioux and land redistribution in the Black Hills. And for architects to show up to that and not assume the center of the space for themselves. I think build a school that way that involves getting on the bus and leaving. I guess that would be my comment.
Thanks, Wes. Will Martin, you're next.
Hey everyone, and I guess also sort of piggybacking on the last two comments from Felipe and Wes, I also commented that it didn't seem like there was much of a path forward for the institution as such. And I was, in my just brief sort of rumination on the question, was reflecting on some experiences that I've just had recently in the job market. and thinking about all the volunteer work that's gone in from many of the folks in the lobby to put this on, and thinking about their work and their labor and their lack of compensation, and also the need to have be able to create a life for oneself. And I just wanted to say, the value that's created by folks who work within the academy is tremendous. And I just want to get to, as opposed to thinking the means, get to the ends, and thinking about what and how that value gets oriented and leveraged. So my comment was sort of to imagine the role of the value of those workers and that work to be sort of subsumed or brought into a collaborative environment. Many of you will know of Mondragon, but Mondragon has its own sort of educational system that is within and a part of the cooperative structure. And so folks who are joining as members and benefit from the sharing of resources and knowledge, then fold again in that value into the organization that is producing that value towards the ends of the whatever ends the organization is trying to achieve. The anecdote I wanted to share was relative to my own sort of debutante experience with the world of coding, and being in a situation where I was a contender for a position where I was competing against two folks who had two-year associate's degrees, and feeling very entitled to the role, given that I had two master's degrees, one master's of architecture and another, master's of science, what have you. I did feel entitled because of that, but also I didn't have the same skills. The skills that they were putting on the table were above and beyond what I had learned and taught myself in coding. This was competition for an entry-level job that I've never had before, that the base pay was going to be $120,000. And I had to celebrate the fact that these people that I was competing against had put their nose down and found a way to get the education that they needed to be able to put themselves in a position to be able to provide in that way for their family or whoever. Obviously, this is in the terms of a financial compensation. I think we could reorient away from potentially financial compensation, but as someone with two young boys and many sort of privileges, but also certain needs, it was certainly compelling to go from whatever middling compensation one might find with the experience and education I had within the realm of architecture, that would be something considerably more and sort of life-changing in that way. So I just wanted to say, not to focus on the financial compensation, but I did want to focus on the ends of what the value that academia and those workers that are more uniquely focused within that space can bring to the value that would otherwise be produced by a broader series of actors and workers that were both in practice in the context of, as I was imagining it, which is I am wont to do and can't seem not to imagine within the context of a broader platform or cooperative that could be structured and that value leveraged and refolded in that way. So just some quick reflections, not a fully formed thought, but that's sort of where I imagine that third path going, maybe to relate to what Peggy had mentioned as a third option in my eyes anyway.
Thanks, Will. Beth, you're on stack next.
First, I just want to applaud everybody's comments so far, so that I won't repeat them, but just build on or tease out a few threads. And I want to respond to what Kristen was talking about in terms of the educational models internationally, because I think one of the things that we struggle with in the United States is that we're still operating in a model of a 5-year accredited undergraduate degree, whereas in the Bologna model in Europe, Australia, there's 3 years to get a university degree. And then you go on and you develop expertise, whether that's technical expertise, design, history, theory, you get that in 2 years. So in 5 years, you have a master's degree. and in theory, you're a critical thinking person at the end of 3 years. I'm not sure that we are in many of our American schools producing critical thinkers even after 5 years because of the box ticking and hoops that we put people through. So one of my concerns is that the 5-year degree, longer than most university degrees in the US, means anybody who's got any financial concern is just not going to go into architecture. They're going to self-select out of architecture. They're going to go into medicine or law if they're smart, or engineering or something else. So we set ourselves up to fail already by continuing on this 5-year versus 4-year degree model in the US, and then we don't do well when we put ourselves adjacent to other models internationally. And I also, this is perhaps my own personal take, but I think this might be shared by a number of people in this virtual room, is that so many people who study architecture are interested in questions of space, but are not necessarily interested in ultimately working in an architecture firm, whether it's their own firm or somebody else's firm. And we need to create spaces for people to imagine what a spatial form of knowledge can do in the world differently, and embrace it and celebrate it and foster it, and not have it just be a factory for future CAD monkeys. And I find that one of the most depressing things about, being in academia. For me, the joy, I just got to listen to a little bit of Gayatri Spivak. To me, the joy is just like emboldening my students to think the future differently. Like, I think most of us are in education because we want to foster that kind of imagination and creativity and sanity about the future. But our current models crush that far too often. So, I'm all for, tactical guerrilla from the inside and reinventing a whole other ship altogether, all of the above. So my appreciation to everything that's been shared with us so far this summer.
Thank you, Beth. Aaron, you're next on stack.
Thanks, everyone. This has been such an incredible discussion. I want to share my same thinking along the lines of Felipe and Wes, in the sense that I think those of us that were really starting this school or thinking about this school, we imagined a kind of post-accreditation model. I mean, really challenging the fundamental ideals of accreditation and state-sanctioned accreditation altogether, which for us, we started to debate whether or not this actually operates as a beta model or some kind of beta test for a school itself or some kind of educational system. And some of us agree and disagree about what that might look like. But I also just want to add this, thinking about the third possibility, drawing on, I think, La Paperson's work about a third university is possible, or Wayne Yang, the same person, thinking about the third university as not an alternate reality, but something that actually operates within existing realities. And so he argues effectively that, to burn down existing institutional structures is difficult and sometimes not possible. And at the same time, starting anew often reproduces the same thing that you were trying to create or critique. So he argues that the third university for him is operating within a decolonial framework and existing frameworks and working from the inside. And so I think, what we mean by a third university or a third school or a third possibility is we mean different things by that. And I think we should be clear and articulate about what that third possibility might look like. And so my duty today was to get us to think about the local and the present conditions. So I'll just throw a couple of things out there to help move the conversation to that line of thought, but feel free to continue the academy questions, because I think they are related. I mean, I think when we start, thinking of accreditation free or perhaps even free of state sanctioned degrees, we start thinking then about the possibilities of global architectural education or global kind of shared networks. And so if we do move to, let's say, a global education platform, or if we move to online systems, then what aspects of the kind of in-person and the local might remain or become increasingly more important? You know, thinking about the complexities of construction methods, of histories, of environmental concerns, which really differ immensely. And so there are a number of responses that you shared, many of you shared. One of you advocated for a move toward an informal architectural education system, similar to programs like the Black Women's Build Collective in Baltimore. And the need to work with people on the ground, so community organizations and tenants. Another response was effectively that it's very difficult to imagine any single institution or organization being actually able to accomplish all the necessary sort of adaptations that are necessary for contextually sensitive student work. So we really need new outlets or new supplements. So thinking about mutual endorsements or rapid and fluid transfers, not of credits, but of bodies, apprenticeship models that might be augmented by Zoom or might be augmented by something like what we're trying to do here. And some of the thoughts, I'm just going to throw out some names, some of whom we've already heard from. But Felipe, for example, in the local responses, you also advocate for a kind of pluriversal way of thinking about learning and doing. So if you have a chance to think and to share those thoughts with us, that would be great. Will Martin, really starting to push against this idea of the uniformity of local conditions a little bit within the kind of context of collective associations and cooperatives, and how we bring multiple locals with us when we start thinking about communal work and cooperative work. And then Megan, again, as you're thinking about you know, the kind of independence or the independence of an academy, how do you then think about also engaging with local communities and the kind of global versus local flows? So I'd like to just open the floor to questions as we start thinking about the local, as we consider these bigger questions about the academy.
Thanks, Aaron. So Josh Barnett, you're next on Stack.
Okay.
Feel free to just respond to anything that Aaron mentioned, or just to continue with the previous team on academia.
Yeah, no, thanks. I was actually going to do both. One, I think, is in a great discussion so far, but I think a lot of the threads in the discussion I'm hearing still kind of reflect the insularity of how we're looking at this question. I mean, I worked, when I got out of school, I went to Pratt. I worked in construction for 2 years, and a great pastime on the construction side was making fun of architects. The construction workers did that pretty much every fucking day, you know, and I had to laugh along because I thought it was pretty funny. But, you know, but that reflects a division, a real division between the people who design and the people who build. My first job was in an architecture engineering firm. The engineers did the same thing. And again, it's that kind of division, you know, between architects and engineers. And there's always all these barriers. And when I worked in an office design firm for 2 years, I never once talked to any of the secretaries about the offices that we were designing, right? It was all, you talk to the client, you spent 90% of your time designing the executive suite, but 90% of the workers didn't have any access to our design. And so I think that a lot of what we need to do is, you know, start to break down these barriers, at least advocating for breaking down these kinds of barriers. I mean, I think that architectural education would benefit hugely if everybody had to work for 2 years in construction, and if we brought construction workers into the design process, if we were taught much more to have a dialogue, not with the client, the people who pay the bills, but the people actually going to use what we're going to do. And I know that's a tough road to hoe, but I think we have to start advocating for that kind of thing right now. And the whole question of debt is not something that just affects architects. Everybody I know who's a young person going into education, no matter what, even people going into medicine and law, now are facing this crushing debt when they get out. And that's why you have writers who are unionizing and adjunct professors who are unionizing. I mean, most people who go into academia, very few people are on a tenure track at this point. You know, you do have these class divisions, and all professions are being, quote, proletarianized, you know, especially with the gig economy. And so, you know, I think that one of the things we really need to think about is what Peggy touched on at the beginning is, what are our points of connection with the larger movements who are fighting for cheaper education, for free education, to alleviate student debt? And how do we advocate for a more reality-based architecture education? And if that means swinging a hammer I think we could all benefit from that kind of thing. So again, I just want us to think about, where are points of unity for people who are fighting against how capitalism is treating all workers, including professional workers now, in the service sector economy. And again, you're just advocating for a more socially conscious and more reality-based education, even if it's not going to happen right away. So I think putting those things on the table and putting them out there is something that we can really start doing at a concrete level.
Thanks, Josh. Tessa, you're next on Stack.
Kia ora koutou. Yeah, I actually mostly just stacked because Kirsten asked about the Free School of Architecture, and I was one of the coordinators of the Free School of Architecture. So it seemed like an opportunity to kind of jump in. But I mean, basically what happened with that school was that we ran it for 6 weeks. It was, completely free. We didn't really have a fixed location for most of it, so we were bouncing around between venues, which was quite a feat because we organised over 80 workshops with a timetable that ran 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. 6 days a week, so that we could kind of cater for people who were working full time, as well as people who were able to take that time off and come to sessions during the day. And there were no students and teachers, there were only participants. And I think what kind of has been interesting for me is that in that process, that we were very kind of naive, the four of us who coordinated the school and ran it. And we didn't do a lot of research because we didn't have time. We had about 6 months to organize the school, and all four of us were living in different cities, and we had no money. And so there seems to be, everyone seems to have the same conversations about accreditation and about these things. And we weren't kind of privy to those conversations until after we'd run the school. Which meant that our kind of naivety was really sort of heightened. And fundamentally the school, even though it was really, really great and cool and exciting, and I think we attracted, there was sort of 70 people who came to the school, and most of those people were teaching themselves, so they taught classes, and then we invited people we thought were doing interesting things within Los Angeles to come and run sessions under the kind of I guess, fundamental ethic of knowledge exchange, and so that they could see the benefit in running an experimental session with a group of 30 to 40 people from a range of backgrounds. We had graphic designers and artists and urban planners. We had developers who came, which was kind of cool as well. That felt like a win. And then just random people off the street. We had a photographer who just walked in and then attended every session after that. And then we just it wasn't sustainable. We didn't have any money. We lost money. It was such a huge amount of work, the kind of, especially for the four of us who organized it. I think we could have made it a little bit smaller. We didn't need to run 80 workshops in 6 weeks, but probably 20 might have been fine. And then kind of allow a little bit more room for organic development, which is what we had planned. And we'd also planned that the incoming body of participants would take over the school and run it, but they didn't kind of take on that mantle. But I think one thing that it's kind of led me to kind of conclude, I suppose, is that we sort of hold, I feel like that we hold kind of historical examples of radical pedagogies behind a kind of veil of nostalgia. And I think that what would be really useful is a kind of, what I'm finding in my research now is that kind of focusing on the present. And I think one of the other Stack speakers was saying that there are incredible examples of this happening everywhere, and how can we kind of common the methodologies of those practices and groups that are already doing the work and kind of existing beyond or resisting capitalist models. And, in the school is a way of doing that. It's connecting all these different methodologies and different groups. And, and I thought that the kind of the OSC model that they talked about was quite interesting to me, of this kind of big collective resource hub that is supporting local movements. So it's not about the kind of top down, it's about the top down kind of supporting through shared resources, the bottom up. And I think that could be a really interesting model for kind of the pedagogy and education, because we already sort of borrow methodologies all the time, that just kind of making those more accessible. It's kind of an interesting way of doing that.
Thank you, Tessa. Megan, you're back on Stack.
Thanks. Great comments. So much food for thought. And I think particularly, I'm starting to wonder, we think so much about the academy and need to restructure the academy, but what about restructuring the work systems and how architects get projects, where these projects are coming from, the city systems of how to hire architects or how the private developers hire architects. I guess, I come also from a city design perspective, and I'm very concerned about who is building and designing our cities, and who is not, and who doesn't have a voice in that, and how that is not reflecting the majority of the population. And so thinking, it's okay, so we come up with a new, innovative, cooperative way to do education for architecture, but then how are we going to get things built? And I guess, that interface with the outside realm, I think what Josh mentioned, but also Felipe and Will, of like, what is the larger context within we're working in? And can we design that context better? Can we advocate for that context better, not just for redefining our own insular part of it? Because I'd love to see more better work being built. And I think particularly as someone who's working in the 8th largest city in the United States, who has zero design oversight, you can't even, projects are now going through ministerial review, not even being looked at against community plans that communities spent years designing. It's all just how do you get things through as quickly as possible with the least kind of resistance. So we're producing shit and we're producing it slowly and without architects. So, that's really my concern right now is it's like, yeah, okay, we need to figure out how to have all my first generation Latinx students not be in debt because they're realizing in year 3 that they're going to earn $43,000 when they graduate a year, and they're surprised and concerned and they've already invested the money. But also how do we make the system that they're entering, give us more, provide more work and more ways to do work. So.
Thanks, Megan. Peggy, you're next on stack.
I'm going to go back to Felipe's and Wes' comments, but so many of the other comments, even Megan's last comment and Joshua's comments, I think are tied into this. But in the scenario that Felipe is giving us, like we screw accreditation when it's like that's not it, and screw the profession for sure. We don't have these structures that tell us what to do and how to do it. It leaves the question for me, and maybe it's not intentional for either Wes or Felipe, about what it is that we would do with our knowledge. And let's not even call it architecture, because it's right that it won't be architecture, it will be something else. But what is it that we left to our own devices want to do, can do, and support each other in doing, so placemaking came up, for sure, and imagining the future for sure, but that's maybe different than organizing architectural unions or making sure, as Sergio Ferro says, that what we really do as architects is organize the building site. Nothing more, nothing less. We're organizing the building site and the workers that are there. That's different than placemaking. Anyway, it just makes me wonder if at some point, if we had the luxury of it, what it is that we think we do in an ideal scenario, or what do we want to do if we weren't told by the existing system. And that, again, that has to do with not being insular, whatever. I just say part of why I think about this is the profession is about keeping people out. We're not letting interior designers do this. We're not letting landscape architects do this. We're not letting builders do this. We're not letting plumbers. It's about keeping people out. But I've always kind of thought that if we didn't worry about keeping people out and we had a loose periphery, there was still something at the center that we recognize that we do, such that we shouldn't worry about the name. We shouldn't worry about the professional, licensing. We shouldn't worry about it. But now I'm beginning to wonder whether we actually do have a center at all. Anyway.
Thanks, Peggy. Will Levin, you're next on stack.
All right, so my point kind of addresses everybody's, but I want to focus on Josh and I want to focus on Beth and what they said. I think architecture and the way that they produce architects is really shooting itself in the foot, in the sense that every graduate of these schools has a massive catalog of skills and knowledge that they've built up for their projects. The work they produce covers every aspect of what an architecture project does. And then when they graduate, they have to go into internships or to architecture firms and do one thing only to get to those more complicated things that they were already doing to start with. And I think if we treated architecture graduates as jacks of all trades, instead of as these, instead of forcing them into a linear career path, I think it would be a lot more useful. And the point that Josh made, that architects are divorced a bit from construction, is absolutely true, because I work in construction too, and we constantly get frustrated with what the architects do. They seem to have no knowledge of what a construction process does, even though I knew this stuff when I was going to school. It's like it just left their mind, like they just completely forgot about the processes involved, even basic stuff like zoning codes. But I also think that saying that graduates are not capable of or not attentive to critical thinking is off too, because I mean, what else have we been doing for 5 years? It's all about learning about what architects are supposed to do in society, their specific skill sets. I don't think any one of us is specifically going to school and getting master's degrees to be CAD monkeys. I think that that's the only job that pays anything worth a damn. I mean, internships pay $10 an hour. I don't know anybody in any city that can live on $10 an hour. So people take the CAD monkey jobs because that's the only thing that's going to pay them and going to support them and pay for the degrees they just paid for. So, I mean, I think if anyone's going to have an issue with what graduates are being taught and where they're going, you should take more issue with the firms that aren't hiring people and not paying people, rather than what they're learning.
Thanks, Will. Amna, you're next on Slack.
Hi. I don't know if I'm the only non-background person here right now, but all the discussion today has really kind of brought me back to the application that I filled out for ABC School, and just kind of looking back at the why question of coming to this gathering. And I thought I'd just read it for a second just to share it with you, because I had said, capitalism, and I'm in contemporary art. I am trained as an artist. I work as a curator within the nonprofit sector of contemporary art in Canada. I'm based in Toronto. And I'd said, to the question of why are you interested in capitalism? It said capitalism and its attendant inequities are redoubled in the spatial and narrative environments of the gallery, where labor, representation, class, race, ability, and gender are metabolized in the judgment and pronouncement of merit, because museums and galleries are systems and places of judgment. And so they're kind of like, there's like a recursiveness to the inequities that are part of capitalism that happen in the aesthetic sort of assessment of within the gallery and museum space. And I said that I was here to learn how to like trouble these sites, because that's where my work takes shape in the form of exhibition design, etc. And I've worked as a builder before, and I have like the technical ability to build within these environments. And so that helps me design within these environments as well. And, as someone who's looking to pursue graduate studies within design, to kind of reorient from fine arts, to kind of think about my interest in working spatially and inquiring spatially, my interest in like taking my practice from within the controlled environments of the gallery and trying to insert them in the sort of dynamic conditions of public, private, and contested space was the interest that is like guiding me towards like grad school in architecture. But there's such it's punishing for someone who's a non-background, because grad school as a non-background is 4 years, you know, and to hear all of these like snippets of people's reality, which suggests that it's actually not even after those 4 years, I would kind of be in the same sort of place that I'm in right now, because culture work shares a lot of these same problematics. So I just wanted to say that I'm hearing all your thoughts, and it's kind of disheartening, because so far I haven't heard any like tangible alternatives to someone who is a spatial thinker interested in like expanding that sense and working outside of controlled environments, that there actually isn't a structured alternative. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Thanks, Anna. Priyanka, you're next on Stack.
Yeah, I think, Amna, the part of this effort is, you know, when we represent the lobby at schools and students show up kind of, you know, hungering for that alternative, just beginning to realize what's in store. I mean, one of the things we tell them is that the alternative has to be made together. It doesn't exist. And so I think this is part of that effort, but you also kind of answered this question where, you know, when Megan said her students who come from underrepresented groups are realizing in their third year they're going to make $40,000 when they graduate. You know, I almost have like this kind of anger to be like, tell them all before they enter school that they will make $40,000. Now that makes the schism, the fault lines even more clear. But I feel like the academy, and I'm almost cynically driven to believe, deliberately conceals this truth from students of what lies on the other side, because the academy is also that middleman that is profiting from that kind of blindness of saying, well, if you tell everyone what it's like, they're not going to come to school. And I wonder if there is a sort of activism there, because I think that, yes, the cat monkey job is the only one that would pay a living wage, you know, and what a life that is. But one could have more freedom if one was not in debt. So I think that there is a kind of chicken and egg situation there. If you imagine if everyone left school debt free and there was a certain degree of social safety net, then you could take a chance and experiment, and everyone who was driven to be that way could be that way and would not have to earn a living and take a chance and try to do alternatives. So I do think, I mean, in the ABC school, we've had this discussion about, you know, does the academy change or does the profession change, or is the change in the academy predicated on changing the profession? And it just seems like it has to happen in dialogue, maybe. But also to Megan's other question of procurement, this is something we've talked about in the hobby a lot, is, you know, builds our buildings, and, you know, what is the agency that is enacted in the world to even enable us or bring us to the table to conceive architecture. So I'm going to make a shameless plug here. I'm the current research coordinator of the architecture lobby, and we want to do a project on comparing systems of procurement around the world. And we have a global audience here, so please get involved. This is kind of one of the core questions of how architecture operates is, you know, how can you have agency as an architect is directly linked to how you get the job to even do architecture. And that, to my mind, I think is that kind of central core that Peggy talked about. I think we make space, and there is an expertise to that. And that expertise needn't be siloed in the academy or in the profession. It comes from a whole lot of, you know, we know from things like Architecture Without Architects, indigenous architecture, we simply know from having lived in different milieus that the built world is made in many different ways. But we really, at least this is a personal desire to begin to build a record of what procurement looks like. Because I think we're trapped in an imagination. I live in New York. I mean, for instance, in this city, they stopped building public housing about 30 years ago. The only way to get affordable housing is by horse trading with developers. We have no other imagination. And we have to explode this idea that procurement is so narrow. So that is something we really want to do. So again, like I said, shameless plug, please get involved.
Thank you, Priyanka. Lena, you're next on stack.
Thank you for that. I think when I put myself on stack, the conversation was completely somewhere else. So I'm gonna shift gears and respond to that, because I completely agree in that, like, I mean, for me, the disconnect between what happens in school, at least for me as someone who studied a Bachelor of Architecture, was emerging from school, thinking of a world of possibilities of what can happen, and then realizing that the steps towards licensure and the educational, all of what I would then need to self-teach myself, basically a whole nother degree, was to then instead learn of all the ways that I can deflect liability. Like, it seems almost like all of what you study for, as someone who hasn't dedicated the time to study for licensure, because even though I graduated 9 years ago, is because it almost seems like every time I start to open any of that information, it's less about a world of how can we be proactive and figure out how to expand a conversation across the silos that we've somehow written ourselves into, like the border on the other side of having agency, whether it's capital economic, or somehow more interdisciplinary in terms of being able to speak more legibly somehow with anthropologists or people who study social conditions. Instead, there's almost this like siloing and gatekeeping deliberately. Like, I think, Peggy, you mentioned this thing about like, oh, all we're trying to say is, oh no, interior designers can't do what we do, landscape architects can't do what we do, but it's almost because we've also been sort of like gate kept from having agency to the next step. So it starts to be more like, how do we be more secretive? And so in like media, whenever you see an architect in a movie, it's always like a mysterious, suave, like rich looking person who like doesn't really tell you what they really do. And it's like some sort of genius idea. And so it seems like, oh, we don't need to pay them. They're already rich. And they do this because it's like their passion. Instead of it sort of being like a role that is somehow a connector. And so for me to have this like existential crisis that pops up in my head weekly or daily or whatever about like, okay, to move up, sure, licensure is necessary in order to participate in the litigious ways that like in the US or I guess globally as well, in order to participate, it's all about just the stamps of like divvying up liability. Instead of at all being like a sort of octopus of collaboration. And so I have this some sort of dream where like, as also an educator, I'm like, it's great for you to continue to think about like, how and why how and why is the built environment shaped the way that it is? But I almost don't want to say, but then you should graduate and then try and do licensure. I want them to, before they even understand that that's what is waiting on the other side, I want them to think through other ways that they can be connectors of a conversation that might lead to some other form of procurement or some other form of like, you know, these kind of joint real estate developer, planner, architect, like someone who's a connector of experts rather than a jack of all trades, but more like somebody who has the vocabulary to speak to and connect, facilitate, and like appreciate expertise in many directions. So I'm not sure what my proposal really is, but more just that what I'm really grateful for with this whole summer session has just been that every week there's been a practice of learning the vocabulary behind how many different people speak about a lot of these issues, and the better we get about articulating these things and like putting ourselves out there and being embarrassed and turning red while we ramble on a Zoom call with a bunch of strangers we've never met, Like you get better at it each time, and hopefully like by having a conversation and being passionate about it when you speak about it, someone else will want to speak about it next time, and maybe we'll all get it wrong, but maybe it'll move forward somehow. Anyways, next.
Thanks, Lena. Felipe, you're next on stack.
I will try to comment on Aaron's question and then move through Megan's, Peggy's, and Anna's comments. See if I'm able to do that. So this notion of the pluriversal is related to a broad decolonial discussion, at least from South American authors that I've read. I don't know the specific like discursive genealogy, but there's one who's Fernando Garcés, who's a pedagogist from Ecuador, and he always insists on the use of the dash between universal, between the uni and the versal, and how universality, which has the same etymological root of one verse, one discourse, and only one that sort of displaces others, so a whole colonial movement. And the other reference is Arturo Escobar, an anthropologist from Colombia, who I think he actually teaches in the US for now several years. And he's been working with Afro-Colombian communities in the Pacific, especially in El Cauca, south of Colombia, with this notion of the pluriverse and the pluriversal, so multiple verses, multiple discourses, and the sort of coexistence of the diverse modes of world making that is like anti-capitalist world making, and how can those different worlds coexist. So there's these two references, and maybe to move to Megan, Peggy, and Anna's comments, I think there's with this notion of the pluriverse and moving from this universal frame in which we think as modernity kind of framed the whole planet, then we need one solution, and there should be one mode of like overcoming capital, no? And I think this notion of the pluriverse is quite strong in the sense that it emphasizes on the multiplicity of modes of fighting, of imagining, of making, of doing. Also, this notion of or this question that Peggy was asking is, what do we actually want to do? And I think that's a very specific or situated question. No, what I want to do in Colombia is very different from what you do in the US or in Mexico. The problem is that architecture has universalized that mode of doing. No, we're completely disciplined by architecture, thinking that there's only one mode of doing. So I think we need to sort of undo architecture in that sense and open up to multiple like pluriversal modes of making. And I think then the challenge is how to articulate those different modes of doing and of making, no? Rather than focusing on one specific, then how can we articulate diverse modes of doing, of anti-capitalist modes of doing. And to Anna's question about a structural alternative, there's this very powerful or potent experience in Mexico, which was Arquitectura y Autogobierno, that's architecture and self-management, which the translation from Spanish doesn't actually convey the potency of the word of autogobierno or autogestión to self-management. I think management is too much related to business administration, and gestión in Spanish is much more communal. So this was an architecture, an academic political experiment in Mexico, in Ciudad de Mexico, between 1968 to almost 1986. It was a bit related to Movimiento del 68, which was a sort of resemblance to May 68 in France. And they started by taking power or taking the space of the university in the school. That's the UNAM, that's the Autonomous University in Mexico. So they displaced the actual school, the architectural school. So they displaced the whole teaching staff, the whole director staff, and they just moved into another architectural school, which was Architectura Beyond Autogobierno, which tried to bridge popular needs and academy. I mean, Mexico was a whole different context in which architecture was being taught, still a very modernist approach to architecture, and they were asking what and how should architecture be taught in Mexico in the 70s, and how to bridge that experience to popular and urgent needs in Mexico. And I've been studying that because I'm very interested in anarchist pedagogies, and there's this incredible link between anarchist pedagogies in Mexico, kind of linked to Ivan Illich, who was in Cuernavaca at the time, and some architects were working and studying with Ivan Illich, and they moved some ideas to Architectura Beyond Autogobierno, and also some anarchists, migrant anarchists from Spain, first and second generations that had moved to Mexico. And there was this incredible idea of how could you self-manage your own education. So there was no curriculum. There was just like studios in which all studios were self-managed by students and teachers with popular needs. So they were working on housing problems, on public space, in communities, with the communities, building everything. The problem was that exactly when they tried to accredit the school, because at the moment in which you try to institutionalize such an experiment, then you missed or you lose your whole autonomy. So the best moments of that experience are between 1968 to 1976. That's the moment in which the school, the university actually acknowledges Arquitectura Beyond Autogobierno. They give them full accreditation, and everything just is downhill from there. But I think those years from 68 to 76 are a great experience. And there's also, I think, an interesting question, and it's the notion of power, no? If we need to take power, or there's other notion in which we reclaim autonomy and not power.
Thanks, Felipe. Jonah, you're next on step.
Hi, everybody. It is, conversation just kind of makes me question why I went to grad school in the first place. Because it shows how lacking a lot of that system is in actually creating possibilities for the future. But overwhelmingly, what I pulled from like this exercise in the ABC school and grad school is that the most important thing about doing this is meeting people and building weird sideways horizontal communities that kind of fall outside of the normal bounds of manager, managee, employee, employer, where it's a lot more nebulous in how we interact with each other inside our field. And we can be from all over the place. But the point is, like, the academy has the ability to bring people together. Now, granted, it has huge problems bringing a big diversity of people, but that is the best part of it, is that you get to meet other people and share your ideas and and talk in good faith. And I think if we're going to have any hope of really changing it, it's going to be about a lot of our attitudes towards each other and being really open to things like this. And we're already showing it by being in the ABC school and things like that, but creating our own plural verses, basically, about how we as individuals see ourselves going out into the world and really trying to communicate and do our best personally to reach other people. I don't know, maybe that's kind of like the real anti-capitalism was the friends you made along the way sort of take, but that is really what I'm learning from like this whole school.
Thanks, Jonah. Peggy, you're next.
There are so many things that I want to say. I just love this discussion. I'll just say before I will take on my role as moving us to next steps, because I think it's time for us to do that. And I think, yeah, Jonah, I think you were actually helping us get to that. But I will just say, don't get licensed. I know that licensing is how, particularly for women, you get legitimized, and you need it to get legitimized. The best way that we can ruin the institution is walk with our feet. Don't do it. There are other ways of participating in the world than getting licensed. And just to say, in Sweden, they don't have licensing, and those people who perform this thing, and they do have accreditation, are much more powerful and earn more money, just to say, than architects in any other EU country. So and in France, people aren't getting licensed because they work in big firms and they know they're never going to have to stop. And so their professional organization is getting starved because people aren't going there. So, anyway, that's me. But I do think, in order to, move the discussion to next steps, I think one way of thinking about this is that there are, kind of different, they're not scales, but different themes within this. And certainly one is how we can and should gather organizations who are already doing provocative work and dismantling work. On the one hand, we can look at institutions like the Dark Matter University that doesn't have a presence here, but there is an example of organizations that we need to figure out how coordinating works, whether coordinating is the right thing, whether rhizomatic is better than coordinated, all those things. But also, there are organizations that you are all in that we need to be connecting to. Woodbury is kind of like, if you go rogue, we want to help, or we want to learn, or whatever. And then Open Architecture Collaborative in Canada, you seem to be doing amazing work. Again, learning from the Movimento del 68, real organizing experiments that are already being discussed here within our own participation groups. So part of it is, how do we organize those of you who are already participating, and how do we organize with others that are doing similar work? But another would really be how and where do we share resources, regardless of what we think the next step for the ABC school, whether it's a school, whether it's us, whether it's somebody else. How do we and where do we share resources and do that? And then I just wanted, on maybe the most practical level, there seem to be a lot of people who are thinking hard about this and passionate about the nature of both the profession and the institution and the discipline and accreditation and the academy. How do we mobilize your intelligence beyond just putting some resources in, which is to say, the people who have organized this ABC school, it's like, need to grow our ranks, or need to disperse our ranks, or need to do whatever. So those are maybe things that I hope we can talk about in 24 minutes.
Thanks, Peggy. Will, Martin, you're next on stack.
Thanks. I guess I'll just maybe pick up on where Peggy was bringing us to, which is, one of the things I wanted to just talk about. And sorry to harp on the example here of open source software and the community around coding. But it's just been a pretty revelatory for me to become, it's a stretch to call me an insider for sure, but having leveraged the resources that are available for free. I just wanted to say some numbers. So it's GitHub, which is the repository for source code. Here it says, I just pulled this, 56 million active users, 190 million repositories, 28 million public repositories. So just as an example of an infrastructure that is providing essential resources that allows anyone to learn and activate a tool set, which is highly powerful to whatever ends that they might be interested in, that's the alternative sort of universe that is being provided in terms of resources when it comes to coding tools, as opposed to maybe imagining spatial tools, many of which might be leverage these digital tools as well. And then the other one would be a space, Stack Overflow, which is a space in which questions are asked for anybody to come in and get responses on any specific project they might be working on. Something like 21 million questions and 31 million answers. I don't know if any of you guys have tried to like get questions answered about a specific code requirement or interpretation of some sort of, I mean, they're codes, it's the same thing. But very, very different environment in terms of empowering practitioners, talk about the liturgical environment, I mean, to get the answers that they need to do a good job and also avoid, being sued. So just wanted to put that up as a foil and just imagine, and a good example of which there are many, many public projects that have very, very impactful ends being created through these mechanisms, which have a simple etiquette that is developed internally by the users, and projects can evolve from that space, talking about procurement in ways in which may or may not have been expected, but certainly is not limited to any sort of predestined or pre-imagined projects. So I think that those are sort of compelling instances. Going back then to just this notion of the local, the resources like that can be leveraged in the particular ways in which one can work within your own locality. So we do a lot of work with our neighborhood association. Some of it has had very minuscule fees associated with it, but it's also where we live, so we benefit from the value which we create, and that's a big driver for us as well. I would love to imagine taking on a more anarchist approach within our neighborhood association, but to me, there's a lot of sort of cultural context in which that operation has to happen, and so the tools and the resources seem to be more, provide more agency to me, like at the immediacy of immediacy with which we're trying to work with the projects we're taking on as a community. So I just wanted to throw those out there, maybe just quickly touching on Peggy's provocation and thinking about examples of spaces in which resources are shared, communities are organized, progress is made, and an alternative ends might be delivered by these shared means. So
thanks, Will. Franny, you're next on Stack.
Hi, Will and Peggy. I just wanted to piggyback on comments that were made about platforms. As someone that comes from more of an art and information architecture background, and somewhat front-end coder, I think about tools a lot and how open frameworks with certain structures in place allow for findability of information and usability of information. And I was going to mention Stack Exchange as well. I think something really special about it is the fact that there's sort of reputation, so that someone coming in new, it's open to the community to view, but you have to build a reputation before you can verify information on there. So there's certain ways that the information is protected from not good faith, I guess. So that's one thing that I think is oftentimes an issue with just an open forum where anyone can leave any comment. And then a couple other kind of things that came to mind were Discord, I think, often offers like a really rich environment for communication, as well as Geneva chat. And then as for more like creating relational data for long-term use for open communities, Notion and Airtable, I think, are also really strong in that they allow for a lot of structured data, with like different information types, allowing for like custom views, whether you want to see things in gallery or tables or lists, and as well as like creating templates of things, which I think is really empowering, similar to downloading code sets from something like GitHub. When you have like a template that is maybe an example of content that someone else in the field might want to use, having that built into the platform itself is such a powerful means of kind of like having a living document. Thanks.
Thanks, Franny. So next on Stack, we had Tessa, but Tessa wrote in the chat that she can make space for others, though she is interested in discussing online toolkits and models that go beyond archiving and databasing. So the Stack is now open, and we could also be reading some of the open questions that were, contributed through the forum and discussing these. We have 15 minutes left together in the session. Aaron, you're on Stack.
I guess I wonder, aside from these incredible platforms, what we might share or what we might collectively identify as a next step or a next organizing effort or next project. I think that might also inform what the platform might be. But then, I think if we would have a series of ideas about where to take this conversation, what resources would be useful for us, how do we expand this, but then also how we kind of guide ourselves in terms of projects and organizing efforts rather than just discourse. So I wonder if there's a kind of specific understanding of where we might go and what kind of resources might be useful to be shared amongst us all.
Peggy, you're on Stack.
I just want to reiterate, or maybe it's not reiterating, but the comment that there were not that many specific suggestions other than, I guess this is, in response to Beth's question, other than this is helpful and more things like this need to happen. But I think implicitly in the conversation we've been hearing in some of the other provocations that weren't about next steps, is a kind of harder question, I think, fundamental question about how much the architecture lobby wants to own this thing. Maybe I'm putting it too crudely, but that has to do with the rhizomatic nature of what we're saying, that there are specific locations that have specific problems that need to be addressed in a specific way. The local totally matters in a way that that no organization, let alone the lobby organization, can organize. So, for me, kind of a fundamental next step is like, how do we support each other? And that's very different than how do we actually think of the next iteration of a school, whether it's the ABC school or another school. I guess maybe I'm trying to narrow this to like, how do we support each other? And then we can think about what the institutional nature of that support is and how it's communicated and how it gathers people and all that stuff.
I'm next on Stack. I had a few thoughts that I've been wanting to share throughout this conversation and experience. And one of them is the role that the lobby could have in an apprenticeship model, as students are going into the field and they're sort of facing how the promise that the school makes or like is very different from the experience of being a professional, and that the lobby could be a place that like sort of helps coordinate the gaps that are there, and through a sort of strategic connection of being both in touch with maybe certain firms that are looking to respond to the mission that is at the center of the lobby, could sort of tactically be coordinating between what the school is like versus what the profession is like, and how do we enact systemic change through this kind of coordination. So that was one thought. And then another thought, based in like the infrastructure of this type of schooling, and how we sort of were able to build this partly like the ABC school with this online model, partly facilitated by the pandemic and the shift to online teaching, and how that sort of leads to I think being in this digital space that is dominated by big tech, which some describe as like an apparatus that fortifies the American empire, and so thinking critically about this infrastructure and thinking about how can we have a digital practice that maybe uses services that are a little bit better, that sort of pushes things in a better direction when it comes to these infrastructures, and also that engages with the world of design as it is forming itself in tech, since tech is like this world through which I mean, a lot of our daily lives have been changed. A lot of professions have completely evolved, because of software, like, if we're talking about architecture, like Autodesk, Revit, and other such things. So I think this sort of critical engagement with these types of software and the types of labor conditions that they put forward is one that, in my sense, we should be tackling, along with like being maybe like a toolkit, and then being strategically coordinating between students and practices maybe specifically that are interested in evolving their model based on some of our missions. Will, you're on Stack, and then I think we'll be wrapping up after Will and closing the Stack.
Thanks. I just wanted to address Aaron's question. Our small firm has just invested in a it's just like a bunch of standard operating procedures for a small firm practitioners. Hey, why don't you go do it with mom? It's super fascinating because it's everything from procurement through punch out. I mean, it's every template you might want. Very well designed. It's intended so each individual could come in and brand every element of it. But everything from Trello boards to like how to track your time, and this is like fully like saturated within the small firm entrepreneurship model. Like how can we make a living as a small firm practitioner? I mean, super inspirational, leave aside all of the specifics, but it's all based on these standard operating procedures, and it's done as a class. And I think we paid like $700 for it. And it's like way worth that amount of money, maybe much more to us, just because it gets everything. We don't have to think through many of these things. It also included Revit template, things like that. I would just love to imagine a resource like that that could be we could look at, in this case, I think it would make sense to do it like, residential small projects. If we want to do small cultural projects, work within the, the nonprofit space. I mean, you can really craft a really nice and tangible sort of step-by-step approach to coming up with a viable business that is like pre-baked. It's almost like imagining like a franchise, concept. Except in this case, like it would be a franchise which is, pregnant with all of the ethics of the conversations which we have here, and hopefully in the context that which I think many of us would like to imagine becoming a cooperative or a cooperative of cooperatives in which that value becomes distributed in a different way. So in this case, one guy in Maine gets my $700. In this other case, where we would be posting this, and obviously we clearly have the capacity from an educational standpoint to deliver, the content, and also to workshop many of the other elements to make sure that they're like value aligned. Man, that would just be so incredible. Specifications, bill of accounts. I mean, I'm talking just the stuff that you need to do to run a business, or run a cooperative. I mean, it's, we would probably have to talk to the guy that I bought it from to see if we could start workshopping the stuff that he gave us, but I'm sure he might say, okay, as a starting point, and then start to share it and see where it goes. But those are things like, that are just super valuable for folks who are trying to get off and running. And I'd rather give my $700 to, the lobby than, this guy seems really nice, but just to answer your question directly. And that's a 30 by 40. I don't know. It's an interesting guy. I feel weird, like I'm not recommending it, but it's an interesting model. It's not something I condone otherwise. That should not be the final comment, so please.
I was typing this, but maybe it's just cleaner just said verbally, because I see a lot of requests for resources from the lobby. And, like I said to Amna's question earlier, like a stock kit of liberation does not exist. So we have to kind of work it out together. So we have in the past found like sort of made solidarities among firms around questions of Me Too, for instance. When Me Too was at its height, we had contacted firms saying, when women come out and complain, they're liable to be fired. What we would like to do is find a group of firms who are sympathetic to saying, we're not saying the lobby will find you a job if you get fired, but we want to create a solidarity network of people who are sympathetic to viewing women who've lost jobs not simply as bad workers, but as someone who has to navigate a very, very difficult professional situation. So you can find those sympathies. The moment the needle starts shifting towards worker power, I think we have to think about like what is the sympathy we are asking for from a firm, and how are we going to get it? Because the moment it shifts to worker power and profitability is affected, because so much of profitability relies on extracting more labor than you are paying for, sympathy begins to decline. And so, this idea of our firm sympathetic to the alternative models, I think that's kind of the effort that we're after there is that this exists, we just have to find it, is, I think, slightly misplaced. What is possible, we had a session on co-ops, we had a session on, alternative models already. And so I think that there's dovetailing with that. There are people who want to build a fundamentally different firm, who have themselves experienced the exploitation that they don't want to wish upon others. And there might be, partnerships in that realm where, again, these have to be created. So I think that this idea that, we just have to find sympathies within existing models, I think it might be a fruitless search, more or less, but in terms of building solidarities and building new models, that is something that we are definitely here for, and making those connections. So the co-op network is definitely one of them. We have a new version of the Just Design project that Peggy is leading. And that is about looking at how workplaces can do better by people. And so all of these things are definitely something that we can dovetail with. And what emerges from these are definitely places and contacts that we can give, but there is not a stock running list of, oh, these are the best, because if that existed, we wouldn't be here.
Thanks, Priyanka. So in the many links that were shared previously and that I'm sharing again in the Slack now, in the chat, there is a link to join the lobby, and also at the bottom a link to learn more about some of the ongoing campaigns that Priyanka just mentioned. So the last Google Doc. And so as you know, the ABC School is part of the academia campaign within the lobby. It's, I think, one of the more sustained like gatherings of people that are outside the lobby that we've had since starting the lobby, I want to say. But if you're, so we obviously wanted to create a sense of a cohort with the ABC School and provide like opportunities to form bonds and to enable this conversation to continue beyond the school. So we'll keep the Slack, we'll keep on existing. You can find each other there. You're also more than invited to, highly encouraged to become lobby members. If you're in a place where there are no chapters, there is also the link to how to form a chapter. It's pretty straightforward. So if you're living somewhere where there's no lobby chapters, you can read through that and then become a lobby member. Apart from that, I think please stay tuned for an invite to discuss publication and the next planning meeting for the academia campaign this fall, or the ABC School rather. We're in this together. We hope you will join for future organizing efforts. We're all organizers. I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind. And you can, of course, if Slack seems like cumbersome or you're not on it, you can email the organizers of the APC School at the email that you all know. If you have any questions about anything or any other thoughts or experiences that you want to share with us.
Can I just add one more thing that if you live somewhere and there's no chapter, there is also an at-large chapter of the lobby that collects members who are not proximate to larger chapters, and so you can join the at-large chapter of the lobby. And another channel would be, if you become a member of the lobby has an internal channel on Mobilize, where a lot of things that are kind of benefits to members are shared there, that are often not publicly shared. And so we really, really encourage you to join the lobby and to join the next iteration of the ABC School. We don't want to be the people doing this again. We want new faces and minds to give this form next time.
Can I just add in one thing? I think what's been great with all of this is that the ability to be able to catch up with other people who have similar ambitions and similar mindsets about making our world a better place through our profession. And I think what's been fantastic is just hearing all the different voices through the provocations that we've had. So thank you all for attending. It's been wonderful to hear from you all and to have these ongoing conversations.